Soil tests, they're important. We know they are. We usually do them every 3 or so years. And then we take them to an agronomist and they give us packets of fertiliser to put in the back of our ute. We spread them on the ground and we're done. Or are we just being done? Chris Guppy is part of the Faculty of Agronomy and Soil Science here at New England University and Armidale, and you've got some perhaps slightly controversial but very sound ideas on soil tests, what they're good for and what they're not good for. Can you take us through a few of your ideas, Chris?
I can take you through as many as your viewers have time for.
Well, I'm going to sit myself down and my viewers are going to make themselves a cup of tea because we are going to learn. So Chris, here we've got a standard sort of soil test.
We do indeed.
And you have perhaps a slightly controversial opinion, but it's rooted in science and it's based on common sense that a lot of people are being oversold on the basis of soil tests.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Look, most soil tests, Tim, come with recommendations from resellers, and I won't name, everyone knows their own local reseller.
And there's really trustworthy and really honourable resellers out there. We're not having a go at resellers.
No, we're not having a go at resellers. But
we're just making people aware.
Yep, and usually they're in the business of selling fertiliser.
Yep.
And there are ways to interpret a soil test that might sell more fertiliser than you might actually need. There's a long-standing tradition. It was a method, I think it's called the Albrecht method or the base cation saturation ratio method. It was developed back in the 1930s in the US, in New Jersey, and it actually did work in New Jersey.
In New Jersey.
Worked in New Jersey, no trouble at all.
But wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more. He got his PhD, he got a job over in California on the other side of the country, tried it out, didn't work. So he'd actually disproved his theory within about 3 years. Most scientists aren't quite so lucky to disprove their theory that quickly, but he managed to disprove it quite quickly. But the beauty of this Albrecht method, the beauty of that method is that there's an ideal soil out there with the perfect amount of cations and other nutrients, and you've got to focus your fertiliser strategy on hitting that sweet spot.
Bringing everything into the range.
Everything into balance. And balance is a very important word these days.
Well, it is an important word.
Holistic and balanced.
But it doesn't always fit, does it?
It doesn't always make a lot of sense.
Okay.
The plant is interested in only what the plant requires. It's not actually interested in a balanced diet. If there's a bit more calcium available than it needs, well, it'll just ignore it. It doesn't really matter. As long as it's got enough, it's happy.
It's only if things are really deficient that there's a problem.
Absolutely. So there's a critical requirement.
Yep.
And sometimes you can get it out of balance by having way too much of something else.
Yes.
But most of the time, this ideal balance, it doesn't actually exist. But it does sell a lot of fertiliser.
So a punter like me, I get a list of table values like this and I don't really understand what all the table values are based on.
Nope.
And I look down them and
That's probably part of the trick, actually. Wow. But anyway.
And I look down this and I go, oh yeah, there's really important elements in here like calcium, we've got some magnesium there.
Yep, bit of potassium.
Potassium, fantastic, you know. So I need someone to interpret this for me.
Yep.
Because there's so many values and there's so many names. But what you're saying is there's really only about 4 things that you bother with, and you're an associate professor of soil science.
I am,
There's only
yes.
4 things that you actually rely on a soil test for.
When I look, when producers give me soil tests and they give me the associated recommendations and they say, this looks like a lot of fertiliser, do I really need this much?
Yep.
I'll look at the soil test and I'm really only looking at 4 numbers, to be honest.
So what are those numbers?
So the numbers that I consider really important, soil pH. pH is, it's pretty non-negotiable.
Things are available or not available, toxic or not toxic?
Yep, absolutely. It affects all that type of nutrient availability, probably less than we think. But if your
there's
pH...
a lot of soil microbe interactions there that make things available outside of the ideal range.
Well, there are soil microbe interactions, but actually there's plant microbe interactions.
Yes,
that will. So plants have been doing it for a long time.
Yep.
They know how to get nutrients out of soil, and if the pH isn't right, they'll actually change it. So they'll actually put acid out of their root or make it a little bit less acidic to mobilise the nutrient, and they'll take it up. But they'll do it just in that little zone right next to their root and expend as little energy as they can get away with to do so. But so the pH, it's
So it's not as fine a trigger point as you think. What's the range that you don't worry about pH?
I look at the pH and I'm looking between 5.5 and about 8. And below
That's a fair
5.5, I'm worried about a bit of aluminium toxicity.
Yep.
And I only worry about that if I then have a look at my soil test and see if there's any aluminium. If there's no aluminium, then I don't even worry about that. You can go down to 5, no trouble at all.
Okay.
But and at the upper end, around 8, 8.2, you'll start to run into deficiencies of some of your micronutrients. That's the usual issue that might come up. Doesn't always have to be that way. If there's plenty of micronutrients or plenty of organic matter in your soil, you can get away with a higher pH. But if I look at a soil test, it's between 5.5 and 8, move on. There's no ideal pH. I'm just looking at it and going, it's in the range that the plant root can cope with, and it can adjust everything else. So that's the number one thing.
So we've moved on now from pH.
Yep.
We've figured out our pH. What do we worry about next?
Phosphorus.
Okay.
Phosphorus. I'm a phosphorus chemist, so people might say I'm a bit biased. And most people will ask the question, surely nitrogen's more important? The reality is, though, we're always going to manage for nitrogen.
And it depends what day you take your soil test on as to what nitrogen's in the soil,
absolutely, because most of the nitrogen in your soil is, 95% of it is in the organic matter. And so to become available to a plant, because plants can't eat organic matter, well, they are organic matter, because plants can't eat organic matter, you have to break the soil organisms have to break the organic matter down. They release the nitrogen in ammonium or nitrate. And that's what we pick up. That's what we pick up in a soil test. But what that means is the number on the test is entirely determined by when it rained last, or
2 weeks it can change completely.
2 weeks it can change completely. A bit of hot weather, a bit of anything that affects the activity of your soil organisms is going to change the number. So I don't pay any attention to it. I literally don't pay any attention to the nitrogen number.
But you do pay attention to phosphorus?
I do pay attention to phosphorus.
What are your number ranges for phosphorus?
So on the soil tests, they usually actually get this one about right.
Right.
There's a lot of science. Yep, it's all good. There's a lot of science around when we see a response to an addition of phosphorus fertiliser. And so for most grazing systems, for most pastures, the critical value is based on what our legumes need, because they're actually the engine driving our the engine driving our productivity, and usually it's a Colwell p-value of 25 and above.
Okay.
If it's above that, I don't worry too much about. Relax.
If it's below 25,
if it's below 25, then you have to think about how you're going to manage it, and you don't actually need an agronomist to help you with that. I don't think.
There's a rule of thumb, isn't there?
There's a rule of thumb on the New England. That's right.
Yeah. So what is that rule of thumb? Because it's so simple.
It's really simple. So the rule of thumb on the New England, and I haven't seen that much evidence that it should vary very much in other parts of Australia at least.
It may vary a little bit, but
absolutely.
This is based on where you're practicing and doing your research.
Yeah, a lot of research out of UNE in grazing systems. The rule of thumb is it's about 1 kilo of P per DSE, per dry sheep equivalent, per hectare per year.
Yep.
And so if your number's 20, if you then regularly, annually, apply a kilo of P per DSE per hectare per year, the number should stay at 20. Well, they've done the science.
You want it to go up?
If you want
7 or 8?
If you want to get to 25, so your legumes are responsive when it rains, which is actually what you want.
Yep.
Then you have to add more than a kilo per DSE per hectare per year. And there is a rule of thumb around that, but it doesn't really matter too much. But if you want to shift it from 20 to 25, you can do it slowly over 5 years, just add a little bit more, then you're taking off. And that's what that kilo is about. It's about the amount of phosphorus reacting with the soil and available in the soil. That's what your soil test is telling you. And the relationship that has with the amount of lamb you're taking off and the amount of wool you're shearing off and the amount that's going off the farm gate. So you're just trying to balance it, and if you want it to go up, you've got to put more in.
Add a little bit more.
There are theories out there, and maybe this is what you're talking about with controversial. There are theories out there that if you just change your grazing strategy, you can magically produce more phosphorus in your soil.
Deeper root systems,
more intensive. Put smaller paddocks in and rotate them more rapidly. And
that has a lot of benefits in a lot of ways.
It has a lot of benefits with respect to worm burdens and all sorts of stuff, so I'm not criticising that. but it certainly doesn't change the P economy at all.
Right.
You can't get something out of nothing. If you're taking more P off than you're putting back in, your P is going to go down.
Okay.
It's
Very simple.
It's very simple. And so,
Bucket.
Yep, so a kilo of P per DSE per hectare per year, and you're aiming for about 25 on your soil test, if you're in a grazing system.
Try and hit and maintain around 25 for grazing systems. Now, this advice is for grazing systems. We've got some horticulture people out there. We're going to get to horticulture in a minute.
Sure.
Because we've got some things to talk about in horticulture as well.
Yeah.
But now we've hit pH, we've hit phosphorus, we've got two more. What are we looking at?
In grazing systems, we're interested in sulfur.
Right.
That's the third thing.
Because that's important for phosphorus, isn't it? And other things.
It's important for other things, and it's important for phosphorus. You do need both phosphorus and sulfur to make amino acids and proteins to grow good, strong, healthy plants. And the requirements in the plant of phosphorus and sulfur are roughly the same.
Okay.
The tissue concentrations of between 0.2 and 0.4%. But you need that sulfur. The problem with sulfur, it's why I look at it next, is because whereas phosphorus will pretty much stay where you put it, and that's actually part of the challenge of managing phosphorus, is it stays
stuck on the
that's
soil.
right, stuck too strong.
That magic 25.
Yeah. So it doesn't tend to move unless you're moving it off with stuck to your soil into a creek.
Erosion, whatever.
Erosion. But sulfur is available to a plant in the form of sulfate, which is a negatively charged ion, and soil is negatively charged. So they repel one another, that's right. And so that means sulfate washes out the bottom of your profile pretty quickly. And so for many fertilisers, superphosphate, very common fertiliser, you've got roughly the same amount of phosphorus and sulfur. But over time,
sulphur's gone.
The sulfur leaches away and the phosphorus kind of hangs around. And so you end up with a situation where you might be okay for phosphorus, but you probably have to pay a bit closer attention to sulfur.
Okay.
And so one way to do that is to find a form or source of sulfur that is slower release. And so there are products out there that have elemental sulfur in them. And elemental sulfur kind of is like organic matter in the sense that it requires microorganisms to break down the elemental sulfur to eat it. They actually turn it into sulfuric acid.
Okay.
Yeah, so it does slightly acidify the soil, but the amounts that you add are so small,
it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't actually have any effect whatsoever.
Okay.
I could tell you an interesting story about golf greens, but it because it requires that bacterial action to mobilise it, it's slower release, and so it stays in the system long enough to be able to provide the sulfur that the plant needs.
So people might not need to put on superphosphate every year. They might need to do a top-up of elemental sulfur because it's actually the sulfur that's more likely to leave the system.
Yes, but most of the time, remember, you're still going that 1 kilo per DSE per hectare per year.
Yeah, okay. So you should be okay with regular top-ups. Now, superphosphate, some people have demonised superphosphate. You don't have a problem with it?
I don't have a problem with it, no.
And in fact, rock phosphate you have a problem with?
Rock phosphate, I don't have a problem with it. It's just if you're going to go and buy rock phosphate because it's organic and purer,
it's sexy.
And it's an approved input if your farm is organic, whereas superphosphate is not.
Right.
Because it's a manipulated product. And essentially the way you make superphosphate is you get your rock phosphate and you hit it with sulfuric acid, which basically the acid breaks down the calcium phosphate in your rock phosphate and turns it into a form that releases far more quickly. But if your soil doesn't have enough acid to do to the rock phosphate what they do in the fertiliser plant, then you can put your rock phosphate out.
And it won't do anything?
Well, you could dig it back up in 200 years if you like. Won't do anything.
So what you were telling me before is you've got to have more than 850 mil of rain and you've got to have a pH below 5.
Or 5.5, 5. Yeah, you need to have really quite acid soil.
Before rock phosphate will actually break down enough to make it useful for plant growth.
Yep.
So stick with the super.
Stick with the super if you can get it. We're not producing as much as we used to.
Yep.
Because we've gone to MAP and DAP as a fertiliser source, the ammonium phosphates. There are triple superphosphates out there, which is a more concentrated form of phosphorus. So it's often per unit of phosphorus that you're purchasing in terms of transport costs. It's probably
It's cheaper.
Yep, and that's
And
what.
nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with triple super. Nope, nothing at all. So
Next on the list, what are we looking at after that?
oh look, you can
We've looked at pH, we've looked at phosphorus, we've looked at sulfur.
sulfur.
Fourth one.
The fourth one, if I had to pick one, in a grazing system,
Yeah.
I might have a look at potassium.
Okay.
That might be the next one on
Because
the
that's
list.
important for the energy molecule in growing plants, photosynthesis, all that sort of stuff.
Oh, it is and it isn't. When I talk to my students about the critical things that potassium does, it's actually about water.
Okay.
Because when a plant's breathing, the stomata on the leaves open and close, the nutrient that they pump into the stomata to open up is potassium.
Yep.
And so if the plant doesn't have the right amount of potassium, then its ability to regulate water loss and transpiration.
Yep. Right.
So I had a student who was looking at potassium in rice in the Middle East. The temperatures get up to about 50 degrees there, and he found that an application of potassium, the yields weren't high because 50 degrees.
It's pretty hot.
It's pretty hot. Most plants don't like it.
Yep.
But
That's the reason why they call Death Valley Death
that's
Valley.
exactly right.
Yeah.
But with a good high potassium status, he got better control over his stomata. And so I'm looking at the potassium and I'm going, I'm looking for a number. I'm not looking at the ratio.
Not looking at the percentage.
Not looking at the percentage. That's
Okay.
falling into the Albrecht trap.
Right.
I'm just looking at, is there actually enough?
Yep.
And that number, on soil tests, it comes out as centimoles of positive charge per kilo, which sounds like a fancy number. It really does. Sounds really chemical and
sounds cool.
impressive, and you've got the right centimoles.
You got the right
and stuff.
centimoles?
Yeah, but 0.2.
Right.
Anything greater than about 0.2, and you're pretty right for potassium. But in terms of
And you can go too hard with potassium, can't you? You can turn your plants red.
well,
I've seen it.
Yeah.
I've seen it in vineyards.
You can. Yep. You can go too hard with potassium, but the issue is you're talking about, am I wasting my money with my fertiliser? And
Yes.
the issue with potassium is that the plant doesn't have really effective self-regulation on potassium. It's like a open buffet from the point of view of the plant. It's going to eat anything it finds. And so what that means is, whereas for phosphorus, you're pretty sure that your soil's going to meter out the availability to the plant because the soil's going to compete very effectively. But the plant, the requirements for potassium are an order of magnitude higher than for phosphorus and sulfur.
Okay.
So whereas you need 0.2 to 0.4 for P and S, you need 2 to 4 for K and N. And so they're always on. If they see potassium, they're going to take it. Because the requirements are so high, they're always turned on for potassium. And that means you put out 100 units of K, and in that first year, the plants will try and take up 90 of it. And then you'll graze that off, and they'll have really K-rich P.
Right. Okay.
And
So it'll leave the farm.
it'll leave the farm.
So
No.
be really careful not to put too much on because you're just wasting your money.
Absolutely. Small.
Yeah.
It's like taking vitamins.
So drip feed.
Drip feed it.
Yep.
For potassium. But most of the time, it's actually quite rare that you'll see a response to a potassium, even if the number's below 0.2. Because in terms of the order of what's limiting pasture growth, pH,
Yep.
water,
Yep.
temperature,
Yep.
nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, 7th on the list. So
Yeah. So fourth on the list with the soil test, but seventh on the list of the plant.
yeah, well, what I'm looking at, that's
Yeah,
right, because you need a bit of water, and a plant will only grow up to its most limiting factor. It's a law that was developed back in the 1780s when they were first even identifying elements and their importance for plant growth, and that law still pretty much holds true. And so for most of the time in Australia, you're limited by water first. If you're in Northern Australia, it's probably phosphorus next. Southern Australia, it might be nitrogen, but they just swap places regularly, nitrogen and phosphorus. And then if it's high rainfall, sulfur, because it's going to wash out the bottom, and then maybe K. But everything else on the soil test, it looks really fancy. There's lots of numbers there. But at the end of the day, I really only look at those. I ignore almost all of the micronutrient numbers.
Now, if we're in horticulture, we really get quite obsessive about our micronutrients.
Yes.
We always do petiole tests, and we're looking at, say, boron and manganese and all of those trace elements because they really impact on the flowering of plants.
On the flowering, absolutely.
But what you're saying here, Chris, is that you can't use a soil test to tell you what's happening in the plant. It's much better to use a petiole test and do that more regularly than a soil test.
Yeah, the reason being that what we've got is we've got a piece of soil that arrives in a lab, and they're really good at analysing and processing with certain tests. But what you really need is a test that relates directly to what a plant root is going to be able to suck out of the ground in that season or in that field. That's the key thing. Now, the Colwell P, that's pretty well tested. The KCl40 sulfur, pretty well tested. There's robust, we've got lots of robust data that as a scientist, I'm perfectly happy to make a recommendation on it. The problem with our micros is that the tests that we use in a soil test lab, they get the micros out, but the relationship between the numbers and plant response is
wide.
Yeah, if I imagine we've got a great big piece of paper and I got my shotgun out and shot it, that's the relationship. There is none. And so we use our plant, like you said, to tell us what the availability is in the soil. The
Looking at
plants,
our
the better.
leaves,
Yep.
looking at the colours, looking at the patterns on the leaves, looking at the behaviour of the plant, whether it's got zigzags between the internodes, all of those sorts of things, they're going to tell you more than a soil test for your micros.
For your micros.
And then you go along and you take petioles, which is the leaf stem, nearest to the flowering point, and at the right time of year, and that's going to tell you what's going to happen for flowering, isn't it?
It should. It should. Yep.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. No, they're the best test. The plant is your best integrator for micros. And the reason you can do that in a horticulture setting is they're micros. So
plants are easy to catch.
They're easy catch. Yeah, you don't. That's true. That's true. But the plant doesn't require much, and so if you pick up the problem, you can pretty quickly fix it.
Just with a foliar spray.
You can spray it on. Problem sorted real quick. With the macros, which is what we're relying on more for the soil tests, it's slower release. It's through the root system. The requirements are much higher, and so when you want to put fertiliser out, you need to have a bit of advanced preparation. The micros, you don't need as much. You can pretty much remedy that on the fly. But the macros, yeah, bit of care. Soil tests for macros, foliars for micros. That's usually how I...
That's your rule?
Yep, that's my rule.
Soil tests every 3 years, good idea?
You could probably even go less than 3 years. You don't need to do it that much. If you know what your starting level is, and the thing is, in the lab, the error doesn't really exist in the lab. The numbers are the numbers, and you could send it to multiple labs, and hopefully they'd come up with the same numbers. Okay, it's pretty robust. The error, well, we've done it, and the errors are quite small from a lab. So all of the problem with interpreting a soil test occurs collecting the sample. Is that sample representative of that field? And if you've got a representative sample, then you're laughing. But how do you get the representative sample? Because I can tell you right now that the variation in a field is fractal. Do you understand fractal? Yeah.
So lots of little bits and pieces everywhere.
Oh, it's just at every scale, the variation is the same. So the amount of variation in a square centimetre of soil is actually exactly the same as the variation in a hectare in an entire landscape. At all scales, the variation is extreme. So how do you actually sample for that? So we know that for a paddock of, say, a hectare, small paddock, the number of soil tests you need to take to get within 10% of what the actual paddock has for pH is 1.
Right.
That's easy.
Okay, we can do that.
We can do that.
We can do that.
We can do that because pH is on a log scale.
Yes.
So yeah, you
So
can
there's orders of magnitude.
magnitude built into the test itself. Okay, so we can get within 10% of the pH with one sample.
Yeah.
But Colwell P, in a hectare, the number of samples you have to take if you're just wandering around, 36.
That sounds like a magic number. What if it's a 10 hectare paddock?
Oh, look, 10 hectares, it would still be 36 randomly located
That's
through
what I
that
was
10
thinking.
hectares. It's fractal.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
But the thing is, no one takes 36. No one.
Yeah. Well, they will now. 36 people.
well-
Remember, the magic number is 36.
No, I won't do that.
Oh, I like things to be easy.
No, the easy way to do it is to look across your paddock at an area that's pretty representative, so not really, really bad,
Yep.
and not really, really good, so not near a gate where
Ignore
they're
the bad
pooing.
spots, ignore the great spots.
You can go and sample the bad spots
Yep.
if you want to know why it's bad.
Yep.
Like, that's absolutely best practice.
And
okay?
sample your hills differently to your flats.
Yep. So you
Make
look at your
different
zones and you work it out,
Yeah.
what's pretty typical. But what I would do is I would get an area about the size of this table, about 5 square metres.
Yep.
I'd get my phone out with the GPS on it and I'd ping it, and then I would take my 20 odd samples in that little area, punch, put it all in a bucket, mix it up.
Okay, so you're not walking right across the paddock
Nope.
in a transect.
Nope.
Which is
Well-
what most people do.
Absolutely, I know.
And this is what they're trained to do.
I know.
This
And
is controversial, Chris.
it is and it isn't. Because we've done the testing, so we actually got a 1 hectare paddock over on one of the UNE farms,
Yeah.
and we sampled every metre.
Okay.
Right.
That's making me feel better.
That's right. So we've
makes me feel more
sampled very, very intensively.
Yes.
And then we've just said, okay, if we zigged this way,
Yes.
we drove the ute up this gully and across here, and just get our sample and put it in a bucket, what number would we get? Because we would know because we've tested everywhere, and we go, oh yeah, that's that number. What if we zagged?
Yep.
We get a completely different number. What if we just drove straight up the middle or gate to gate? We tested all of these things, and the complete randomness of zigging and zagging and stuff, you're never going to get it. It's just the variation's going to kill you. So how do you beat it? You pick an area that's representative, little small area, and you know exactly what's happening in that area, and you go back to that area, and you just monitor the change over time.
So don't monitor your whole paddock.
No.
If this table's your whole paddock, you've sampled this piece of paper,
And
come
you
back
know
and
it.
monitor this piece of paper, and you'll be
Yeah.
more accurate, is what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely.
My mind blown. That goes against everything I've learnt. That is, and I love that when these things happen.
Yep. No.
That sounds like science too, because you're actually monitoring where you've sampled.
Well,
not
we know
trying
what the
to
number
guess
is.
What your transect was.
Yeah, you never guess your train, because we know zigging and zagging will give you different numbers,
Right.
and and all the error is in the sampling,
Yes.
not in the lab. And so the solution is get a sample that you trust, and that's by getting it and you can pick multiple locations in a paddock.
Yes. Maybe one on a hill.
One on a hill,
flat.
one on the flat. Look
near
in
the
look
creek,
in the bad spot
in the top.
and have a look at avoid camps and stuff where
Yeah.
there's
Avoid water troughs. Avoid gates.
That's right.
Avoid trees.
All the standard rules. You do that. So you just get a representative part of your paddock, and you just know what that number is, and then go back and watch what happens to that number. It's the best way to test. So maybe you do it and you get your number and it's 15 Colwell, and you go, okay, my rule of thumb, a kilo of P per DSC per hectare. I wonder if I add it so that I want to get that up to 25. I should be able to, if I go back to the same spot and I have confidence, watch that number slowly rise over time. And we've actually done it. There's been a lot of research here.
And it's proven.
Yeah, I'm pretty
peer
comfortable
reviewed
with
and
that.
proven.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
Well, it's even harder in cropping systems because you think about how you apply fertilizer. Like in grazing systems, you're normally spreading it out broadcast over the surface. But in cropping, you're putting them in furrows.
Yes. So, Chris, we've got some fantastic ideas here about soil testing, and it's going to save us a bundle of money if we follow these general guidelines. There are only 4 numbers that matter on a soil test. The first one is pH. Should be
between 5.5 and 8 in water. You normally get 2 numbers on a test, water and calcium, but the water one, 5.5 and 8.
And there's a danger with adding too much lime if you're up in the 6s to try and bring it up to 7, and that is that you'll go too high, isn't it?
Yep, if you go too high, you'll run into a problem that's called lime-induced chlorosis.
Yep.
And so you follow your agronomist's advice on how much lime to add, because what they're going to look at in your soil test is some of the other numbers that we haven't spoken about. They're going to look at the CEC, the cation exchange capacity, which tells us how much the soil is going to resist a change in pH. And
how hungry it is for lime.
Well, it's really the acidity. And so what happens is you're trying to deal with the acidity, the aluminium, and if the CEC is low, then there's not much buffer capacity there, and too much lime, and you're going to blow it over the top, and you're just going to have undissolved lime.
Plants.
Well, you're going to have lime-induced chlorosis. So
The next one that's important is phosphorus.
absolutely, and we're aiming for about 25 to keep legumes in our pasture. And if you're just on ryegrass or just grass or something like that, then you're probably wanting to aim for about 15.
Well, you're probably a crazy horse person if you're just on grass anyway, so we should always be having legumes in our pasture.
We should.
And the next one that's important is sulfur, because that washes out.
It does. As we talked about, you can lose it out the bottom of your bucket, and so
what value for sulfur?
we're looking at about 6 to 8 is roughly the number for KCl40 extractable sulfur. There's a couple of tests that labs might use, but the standard test should be a KCl40 test, and that was actually developed here at UNE.
Congratulations.
Graham
It's
Blair, my
important.
predecessor.
It's a very important test. So on our soil test, somewhere between 6 and 8 for sulfur.
6 or more. 6 or more.
Right.
And actually, it could be 106 or 1006. Plant doesn't actually care. No, it doesn't matter. So it's that 6 number is what you're aiming for.
Potassium's a small number.
Potassium's a very small number, 0.2.
Right.
And so most soils, unless they're really, really light granite type country or pure sands, they can normally deliver about 0.2. Yeah.
Micronutrients, better to test the plant,
Absolutely.
because the plant will tell you what it can actually get and what it can't actually get, because there's a lot of variables there.
Oh, the plants have so many tricks.
So do
Plants are
petiole
clever.
testing for that, or leaf
Or
testing
just
for
leaf
that,
testing. Just cut the shoots.
depending on your crop.
Put it in a bag, and if you can dry it out a little before you send it to the lab, that probably helps a little bit. And send that off to the lab. And
Don't sample your soils in transects. Don't try and zig and zag.
no.
Instead, find a smaller area,
Yep.
sample a representative area, and come back to that.
Come back to that.
Now, your agronomist is going to try and look after you, and there might be some occasions where the agronomist says you really need to buy this bag of goop,
Yep.
and you need to spread this over your whole property.
Yep.
Now, rather than have a fight with them or argue with them, because they're probably more trained than you are, what's your advice?
My advice is buy a bag, find a strip, put the bag out, and come back in a year and see if it made any difference.
And if it didn't?
And if it didn't, then you've saved yourself an enormous amount of
98
money.
bags.
Yep, you've saved 98 bags of goop. You put a strip out, test what's going on.
When you're doing your soil test in your small defined area, rather than doing the transect, how many samples? What's your magic number? There's got to be a magic number, Chris.
The statisticians, the scientists have gone out and said take 25 cores roughly in a small area and bulk it all up and mix it up, and then take a sample and send that to the lab, and that will give you a good picture of the variation that's happening in the area that you want to sample.
So don't just go to a small area and dig 1 or 2 holes and be done with it.
No.
You do 25
because you want to have confidence in that. You might as well zig and zag if you,
Gotcha.
Get a good idea of what's happening in your small area and make that area representative, and then when you drive your tractor and spread your fertiliser, you go over that area and you can watch that change over time. And that's the value of a soil test, is actually watching the long-term change because of your management.
Which brings me to my next point.
Yep.
How frequently should we soil test?
I think you should be testing each of your paddocks that you want to make money off at least once.
Yes.
Most of these numbers aren't going to change very quickly,
Yep.
so you can come back in 5 or 10 years. But
Okay.
if you've got
So we don't have to go out every 3 years and test our soils.
No, I don't think
Just
so.
come back every 5 or 10.
Yeah, but because if you
But do more samples. Don't just sample the one paddock and assume that all your paddocks are the same.
well,
Sample them all.
you know that they're not the same.
Of course.
Because you know how much grass that one produces versus that one. And
Yes.
so get a good handle on it's your resource. It's your money-making
And a soil test doesn't cost you a lot of money.
And soil testing doesn't cost you a lot of money. People will spend lots of money on like a fungicide spray, $35 a hectare or something to put that out, and they won't put a soil test out. And there are companies that shop around, find a reputable company, and stick with them.
And have a good relationship with your local agronomist.
Have a good relationship with your local
build up
agro.
that knowledge with them over time, and they'll get to know what you want as well.
They will.
Chris, great to be with you today.
No worries, Tim.
School of Agronomy and Soil Sciences here at the University of New England is doing amazing things. It's been a privilege to talk to you.
Yep.
And I'm going to put a link in the description so that people can get hold of the faculty to find out more about the programs that you run and the advice that you provide.
Okay. No worries.
Guys, don't forget, if you like this kind of content, hit the subscribe button, give it a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to the channel. And there's plenty more on timthompson.ag. I'll see you next week, but not with Chris.